Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman, and welcome to my tutorial for learning how to paint night scenes. When I say night scenes, I really could be talking about any scene that doesn't have the type of light we're used to seeing in daylight. These scenes can really turn our understanding of light upside down. It's not enough to just paint the way you usually paint and then add a really dark sky. Night scenes really affect all the lighting of everything in them. For my first sketch, I'll paint a sunset scene in Venice, Italy. I start off with the sky. As you can see from the reference photo, it's the lightest area in this painting. And I want to have a soft transition from one color to the next. So I paint in with just water in all the areas that will be the sky and the reflection of those sky colors in the water. By wetting those areas, I ensure that as I paint, my colors will transition smoothly from one color to another. I love this wet into wet technique. And because everything else in this scene is darker than the sky, I'm not worried about painting around my piers or the boats or the buildings. I'm just painting right over them. Those are so dark that I can come in and paint them right over the sky once the sky is dry. I'm being generous with my water so that it doesn't start drying by the time I finish putting it everywhere it needs to go. I start by painting the darkest part of the sky at the top of the scene, and then I lighten up the color as I come down into the lighter part of the sky. It's very common that in sunrises and in sunsets, there is a really big difference in color and in value between the higher up sky and the sky closer to the horizon line. And you'll notice that I left that part of my sketch just the white of the paper. I didn't add any blue to it, so that now I can come in and add some orange and some yellow. Where the orange and the yellow meet up against the blue, I don't brush stroke it in. I don't want to over mix those areas. If I over mixed it, that yellow part would start becoming green and the orange would start becoming brown. So I just lay it in on that white paper that I preserved when I was painting the blue, and I don't go in and keep brush stroking it. While the sky is still damp, I come in and darken the very top edge again. That dark blue really tells us that this is transitioning from either night into day or day into night. Because it's damp, I still get the soft transitions in color and value. And then it's time to let the sky completely dry. Once it's dry, I can start painting in all the darker shapes in front of it. It could be tempting to just come in and paint them really dark and black right from the start, but I've ruined a lot of sketches and paintings by going too dark too soon, really misjudging just how dark those shadows have to be. I prefer to sort of baby step towards the real darks. I start by painting the lightest parts of the subject that I see in my reference photo, which are the buildings in the background. I'm painting with a really watery mixture for right now, and then I can come in and build up the darks as I figure out my values. I never paint using a black paint right out of the tube. I tend to get all my darks done by mixing colors together. And my base is indigo for these. Then I might add some reds or oranges to it to make it warmer, or I might add some blues to it to make it a little bit cooler. Here you can see I'm using it really watered down as I figure out the shapes I want to sketch in and just how dark I might need to go. When it comes to painting these sunsets or sunrises, decide what colors you will use, make those choices, and stick to them. The trick to getting these nice, clean, and smooth skies is to not keep changing your color choices. The more you paint into it, the muddier your sky will look. Sunsets and sunrises have a similar light condition. In both, the sun will be casting long shadows of anything in its path. The light tends to be much more colorful closest to the sun and gets more muted the farther away we get from that light source. Often you will see a halo or a corona around the sun. I tend to paint that really with soft edges and often just leaving it as the white of the paper. Making sure your sun has soft edges gives it a sense of a glow. You could paint it with a hard edge and then it will give it a completely different sense, more of a high noon feeling to it. In this particular scene, Venice is backlit by the sun. This is pretty common in early morning or late in the afternoon when the sun is getting lower in the sky. You will see objects getting backlit, which means you'll be painting them in silhouette. This creates a really nice dramatic lighting scheme. And a dramatic lighting scheme can lead to a nice dramatic sketch. Often when subjects are backlit, you'll see an edge of lighting around them. I don't see it in this particular scene from Venice, but it's common to have just a sliver of light showing up around the edges of your silhouetted objects. When water is backlit, it often will sparkle and glow. My biggest tip is to not go in all black all of a sudden. You can see that with the gondolas that I'm painting here, I'm keeping it pretty light, and I know that this will lighten up even more as it dries. I've added some bluish tones to my indigo here as I paint these in. Once I feel more confident about the values, I'll understand better how dark I can get in this area, and I can come in and darken pretty easily. I've used thicker paint to paint those wood poles, and they're nice and dark, and I can see that I can indeed go this dark on all my silhouetted objects. In fact, in my reference photo, it's hard to even distinguish between the gondolas and the poles because they're both so dramatically dark. So I come in now and really darken up the gondolas. Now my color scheme and my light scheme are really starting to match with what I see in my reference. I add some thick yellow ochre to the right hand side of these wood poles, as they would be reflecting some of the yellow warmth from the sky and the sun. I don't want to overdo it with this, so I drop it in while those poles are still damp and let them softly diffuse together. This just gives a little bit more of interest and lighting schemes to my sketch. And then it's time to darken up all the other architecture around it. Once my sketch has all the lightest areas painted and all the darkest areas painted, it's easier to understand how much darker I might have to get some of the areas I painted earlier. These values are painted by comparison. For example, those houses in the distance, are those lighter or darker than the areas I'm painting now, and by how much? Making those comparisons will help you get more precise with your values, recreating the scene as you see it. With all these darks in place, I can really see how the buildings in the far distance have to darken up. They need to be darker than they are now, but they have to stay lighter than the gondolas are. They're closer to the sun, and it makes visual sense that they would be lighter. Because I just want to darken them a little bit, I use very watered down paint. I paint in a few of the reflections I see in the water, not wanting to overdo it, just to create a little bit of contrast and sparkle in the water. And with that, I'm done with my sunset in Venice sketch. For the next sketch, I chose a pretty dramatic image. This image is from pixabay.com, and it's of a young boy sitting on a rock holding a lantern. It's definitely a night scene, and the lighting scheme is completely different than what we might expect to see during the day. This is a kind of night scene that generally has a lack of light, but then it's punctuated by a very specific light source, the lantern he's holding. The quality of light from that lantern is warm and soft. It has a slight corona and feels especially glowy. As I want to capture the light of his lantern falling on this scene, I'm paying attention to the edges of the light. Does that light softly diffuse into the surrounding area, or does it have a hard edge where it stops? In this image, it's definitely soft and diffuses softly into the rest of the scene. The most saturated colors are going to be any colors that are closest to this light source. Everything else will have muted down colors. Oftentimes, night scenes have multiple light sources. For example, if you were painting a city street, you might have light coming into the street scene from the windows, maybe neon light from storefronts, maybe the moon or street lights. That can really create even more confusing lighting situations, as each light would have its own quality, whether it's cool or warm, and its own direction, casting shadows all over the place. Luckily, with this scene, we really just have the one light source, the lantern he's holding. And that makes it easy to identify where the shadows should be. I started off by painting the rock he's sitting on and this tree behind him. And even though I know these areas are really dark, again, I don't start off right away with my darkest darks. I sort of sneak up on them. I want to get what I consider the local color down first. The local color of the grass and the trees is green, but in night scenes, it often doesn't even look green. It gets so dark. So I'm making a mix of green and then my indigo. Again, I'm not going to go in really dark quite yet. I pick up indigo to start painting in the first layer of shadow on the rock he's sitting on. Consider also that in night scenes, the sky is not always the darkest part of your scene. I find that usually the shadows that are cast in a scene are even darker than the dark sky. As I evaluate the scene I'm painting now, the darkest darks are the right-hand side of the tree and the shadow on the rock that he's sitting on. Because he's holding a lantern, I also want that to have a glow and be the center of light in this scheme. So I'll paint the four corners darker than what I paint the rest of the sketch, giving it a vignette of light in the center and darker around the perimeter. That lantern in the center of the scene is the lightest part of the scene, but the light is casting some really beautiful ambient light on the boy and the rock itself. So I want to be sure I don't paint those parts too dark. I want to preserve some of those light highlights we see around the edges of his hat, his arm, and the rock he's sitting on. As I start to paint all the foliage in this scene, I don't want to just go in and paint it a dark green. In some areas, it does look dark green, but in other areas, it is really just as dark as the shadows. So I'm using much more indigo in those areas. And just like in that scene I painted of Venice, you can see I'm not going in right away with my darkest darks. I'm tiptoeing up to those values to figure out just exactly how dark they need to get. And I'm definitely lightening up my color choices and my values as I get close to the lantern. And I can see already that I can get quite a bit darker in the shadowy areas behind him. The shadow on the tree, the shadow of the rock he's sitting on. The color scheme now almost looks like a daylight scene. And you can see how it would be tempting to think I've captured it, but I really have to darken quite a bit and then create those shadows that are behind him on his body from that lantern. The lantern is throwing quite a bit of ambient light on the front of him, giving him a slight glow, but his backside is in shadow. And I darken the vignette effect around those corners. Once I have that light green in the background, I can see that that has to get quite a bit darker as well. To pick up some of the rim light around him, I just leave in the white of the paper. In other words, I painted his hat and I painted the background, but between those two areas is a slim, little sliver of white paper that creates that backlit halo. To create some of the glow from that lantern he's holding, I add a little bit of orange into his skin tones. Notice I use my towel to pick up a little bit of that paint by the lantern to be sure that stays nice and light. Now that I have most of the colors in place in this sketch, I can really see where I need to start darkening up. And I want to be sure I create that sort of halo around the lantern. As I darken up the grass around him and the trees, The rock he's sitting on definitely starts standing out as not having a dark enough shadow. So I come in and darken that shadow. I want to give it a nice soft edge like I see in the reference photo. And now he's beginning to look much more like he's in a night scene than a daytime scene. I need to add the shadows behind him. And with that, I definitely do a very slow approach to the shadows. I add some watery orange to retain that color and glow of his skin, and then I'll come in and start darkening up with the shadows. Because I'm painting with a lot of water in my mixes when I paint his skin, every time it dries really light. So now I'm coming in with even more pigment. I need to be able to darken those shadows behind him, which will make the glow in front of him really stand out. I pick up my smaller brush to darken the foliage around his hat. That'll really help the hat and the rim light around it stand out. And all it needs now is a little bit more shadow on his body. Again, by comparison, his body is not as dark as I need it to be. Whenever something doesn't look right in a night sketch, double check your values. Getting the values right in a night scene is the hardest part because we're so used to sketching during the day when lights and darks behave very differently. And with these last few brush strokes, I'm done with another night scene sketch. Remember that you can adjust the colors and the values to suit you, to capture the scene the way you want to remember it. I hope you have found this tutorial useful. And as always, thank you for joining me.